Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming to my talk. I'm Sounil Yu, and as we wrap up Cloud Native Security Day, I wanted to share some perspectives on how the security technology landscape might be changing, particularly as we adapt our practices to address the cloud native world. So, in my prior role at Bank of America, I had the responsibility of making sense of the security technology landscape and charting a path to navigate it. This is a non-trivial problem because there are literally thousands of security technologies and vendors out there, and it's challenging to understand how each one might fit into a portfolio of capabilities. To address this problem, I created something that I call the cyber defense matrix. It's a simple matrix, and it consists of two dimensions: five things that I care about: devices, applications, networks, data, and users, and five things that I do in security: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, or essentially the five functions of the NIST cybersecurity framework. This matrix was particularly helpful in understanding and tracking what security vendors do. By putting each security product into this matrix, I was able to organize them in a way that helped me compare products and understand what I might be missing. Now, as I looked at at all these different products, I noticed something missing. I noticed a pattern that I found quite interesting. And if you look at the matrix and how various companies aligned against it, you'll probably notice a rather obvious pattern as well. By the way, I'm not endorsing any of the products here, and the specific names of the vendors are not important, so I've fuzzed out the icons. But what I do want you to notice is that the preponderance of the technologies are on the left side of the matrix. And there are very few security capabilities on the right side of the matrix. This led me to create the degree of dependency spectrum that you see on the bottom of the matrix, where it seems like we have a much greater dependence on technology, on the functions of identify and protect. And this starts shifting when we hit detect. And instead of seeing technology startups, I start seeing service-oriented companies, which focus on offering people to do detect, respond, and recover on the right side of the matrix. But as you can see on the degree of dependency spectrum, I still predicted that we should see some technologies on the right side of the matrix. And I wondered, why are there so few technologies on this right side? Um, as I look at all the different technologies out there and the many empty boxes that I saw in the matrix, I had to wonder, is our industry really solving the right problems here? And so that led me to look back historically on our collective security journey to understand how we got here and where we need to go in the future. So let me briefly walk you through that journey. So first, in the 1980s, information technology became cheap and affordable to the masses. And so enterprises started buying lots of it and started incorporating IT into every part of their business. The first challenge that we encountered was that of asset visibility and management. We started asking the question, what did we just buy and what business function did it support? We needed to be able to identify our IT assets and classify them according to what they do and how critical they are to our business. The solution to this challenge came about through IT asset management systems. During this era, there was no tension between IT and security because, for the most part, there was no security team. Now, next, in the 1990s, we started seeing really bad viruses and worms propagate through our computers. We saw attackers walk into our networks without anything stopping them. We saw how poorly configured systems allowed attackers to easily compromise unnecessary services and gain a foothold into our environments. And with these challenges, we started to introduce measures to protect our IT assets. And these manifested through things like security configuration guides, antivirus software, and network firewalls. Um, Now, as we continue to go through, security gets stronger. We start seeing, or rather, the security team now exists, and because the security team is telling the other organization to turn off things and destabilize the environment, we start seeing tension between IT and security. And at this point, the security team is really just a hobby shop focused on vulnerability management. Next, in the 2000s, we saw that attackers were able to bypass antivirus, firewalls, and other protective controls. And so we needed a way to detect when that occurred. In addition, we started getting inundated with logs and thousands of alerts that needed to be examined and investigated to really see if an intrusion occurred. And so out of this need, we built technologies like security incident event management systems and intrusion detection systems that help us define alerting rules that triggered on unusual activities. As the security team continued to gain more executive level support for enforcing more draconian security policies, it created more IT and business impact. And so the tension logs on a 24 in the 2010s, we realized that our protective and detective systems were far from perfect. So we found that our antivirus systems and firewalls were easily evaded. Our analysts were overwhelmed with poorly tuned SIMs that churned out false positives, and there were fires everywhere. So we needed firefighters and firefighting tools. At this point, the tension between the two organizations hits a boiling point where there's too much of a conflict of interest between the CIO and the CISO. And so in many organizations, the CISO function, the security function, splits off as a dedicated business unit, and it becomes more risk management focused. Now, what's interesting about this sequence is that that maps nicely to the NIST cybersecurity framework. Each era maps to one of the phases of the NIST cybersecurity framework. In the 80s, we needed to be able to identify our assets. In the 90s, we needed to be able to protect our assets. In the 2000s, we needed to be able to detect intrusions against our assets. And then lastly, in the 2010s, we needed to be able to respond to the breaches that we saw. So then the 2020s will be the age of recover, the fifth function within the NIST cybersecurity framework. And although it's the age of recover, I would also like to call it the age of resiliency. But what might the recover or resiliency era look like? Or more specifically, what kind of problems might we see in this era that will challenge our ability to recover? If we map potential challenges against the traditional security paradigm of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, then we can see potentially the different types of attacks that we'll see in the age of recover. And what we see are things like ransomware, WikiLeaks, basically things that we're seeing actually now that really causes irreversible harm. Now, you can look at ransomware and say, well, you can pay the ransom, but really every organization should treat ransomware as an irreversible event because for all intents and purposes, there are going to be situations where if you've been hit with something like that, like NotPetya and WannaCry, it is for all intents and purposes a irreversible action. So if the problems that we're facing are irreversible and irrecoverable attacks, well, what kind of solutions do we see in the market? And if I were to give you an example of what we don't need or shouldn't need to be able to address the age of recover, here's an example. This is an advertising campaign from a major security vendor. And what we see here is a call to go back to the 90s, to join the prevention age, which happens to be the 1990s. And the question, of course, is, well, if I have a 2020 problem, how will a 1990s solution help me address a 2020 problem? In each of the eras, we faced new challenges that directly undermined our ability to identify, protect, detect, or respond. And so we had to develop new solutions to help us overcome each of these challenges. The prior era solutions did not solve the current era's problems. And ransomware is a new type of challenge that directly undermines our ability to recover. But when we go to the security vendors, all we get is more protect, detect, and respond. And ultimately, we have to ask, what are the solutions? We need to ask for the solutions that directly help us address the recover problem and not more of the stuff that we've seen in the past. So if we're going to fully embrace this assume breach mentality that we adopted in the 2010s, then we've got to look for those solutions that, again, truly help us recover. And if the solutions of the past are not fit for problems of the future, then what should we be looking for? Well, as I looked for recover-oriented solutions, I ended up with an assortment. I ended up with an assortment of interesting design patterns and capabilities, such as content delivery networks, design principles such as copy on write, where you never erase anything, you just keep appending, New technologies, new technological approaches such as Docker containers and serverless functions, all things cloudy cloud, and even buzzwords like blockchain. And as I looked at all these different solutions that help us recover or be resilient, I found an interesting pattern emerge. And there are three core design principles that undergird these different solutions. Each exhibit some quality of being distributed, immutable, and ephemeral. And these three core design principles form what I call the DIE Triad. But more than just helping with security, I mean, there's a lot of security benefits that these different principles confer. But more than that, it turns out these new patterns actually eliminate the need for security at all. So for example, if I have something that's highly distributed, why do I need to worry about the availability of a single system? If I have something that's immutable, why do I need to worry about its integrity? And if it's ephemeral, why do I need to worry about its confidentiality? It turns out if we design towards the new paradigms represented by the DIA Triad, we need not worry about the CIA Triad. In other words, if we can have our assets DIE, then why do we need to CIA them? And I think we should revisit some of our primary approaches for how we do security. Because, for example, when we consider the traditional risk analysis equation, risk is oftentimes seen as a product of likelihood and impact. Likelihood is made up of two factors. One is vulnerabilities, and it seems like we see a never-ending set of severe vulnerabilities. You can be completely patched today, and tomorrow you'll have yet another vulnerability that you need to patch. And if you don't patch, it just gets worse over time. Likelihood is also made up of threats, and our threat actors get better in terms of their skill sets and remain pretty persistent in trying to break in. Vulnerabilities age like milk, and threats or attacker skills age like wine. And the combination of the two means that likelihood is going to increase over time. And unfortunately, this is largely out of our control. However, what is in our control is impact. With likelihood going up, if we want to reduce risk, we need to focus on how we can dramatically reduce the impact in this risk analysis equation. And I think that the cloud native world provides us a way to do that. And to explain, I'm going to use another analogy that I think many cloud native practitioners might already embrace. It's the notion of pets and cattle. And if you're not familiar with it, let me explain. So pets are things that you give it a name, and if they get sick, you take it to the vet, and you like giving it hugs. When we think about how we used to build systems before the cloud, we basically built a lot of pets. Our machines had names that we can pronounce, and when it had a vulnerability or a problem, we took it to the cyber vets to patch it and make it better. We liked hugging our machines, and things like our personal laptops and our national ID numbers are pets. Cattle, on the other hand, you brand it with an obscure, unpronounceable string of characters, and when it gets sick, you cull it from the herd and you move on. And containers, Lambda functions, and credit card numbers that continuously change are like cattle. When it comes to our pets, we have to CIA them. But when it comes to cattle, we should design them to DIE. Now, you may wonder, well, how do I know what's a pet and what is cattle? And as I tried to answer this question, I found that it was actually pretty helpful to look at data that aligns with the principles of the DIE triad. For example, let's take ephemerality. If the goal is to make things short-lived, then perhaps we can measure how long-lived it is, right? We can measure something like uptime. And it turns out this data is pretty widely available because most organizations that have a CIO have a key performance indicator, a KPI that's based on uptime. So now let's suppose I can get the uptime of every system or component that I have running. I'll end up with a graph similar to this. Now let's suppose I set an arbitrary threshold of 40 days, meaning anything that's older than 40 days is a pet. Anything younger than 40 days is cattle. So according to this graph, then I've identified 500 pets with an overall ratio of 2.5 pets. Now let's suppose I want to lower that threshold from 40 days to 10 days. I now end up with 2,000 pets and an overall ratio of 10% being pets. having so many pets may not be desirable either. I may want to try to push the organization towards a different goal where I move towards, let's say, uh, 2.5% pets and 10 days as a threshold for what becomes a pet. And so it allows us to set these interesting targets that actually help us become more resilient. And one thing about this particular curve is that I think it provides a great way to represent a quality like resiliency. So resiliency is an emergent property, and it's hard to measure directly. But one can argue that the shape of this curve is a representation of resiliency. Consider two different shapes of curves. So one would be an L shape, where you have one pet and thousands of cattle. And the other one would be the shape of the number 7, where you have thousands of pets and very few, if any, cattle. And I think you would, if you were to consider those two different shapes, it should be pretty clear that uh, an organization or an environment that looks like the shape of an L will be far more resilient than an organization that has the shape of a 7. Now, the thing is, we're all going to, as much as we like to get rid of all our pets, the reality is we'll still always have pets. And ultimately, what we want to be able to do is be cognizant of when we create pets and when we have cattle turning into pets. And so when we think about what we need to do in the context of the cloud native world, we want to be able to first adopt design patterns that promote the creation of cattle. So I have this adage where I say cattle in the cloud, pets on-prem. So if you're going to build in the cloud, definitely build them to become more like cattle. It's not to say that you can't put your pets in the cloud. In fact, we do that all the time. But we need to be cognizant of when we do that and to provide the necessary protections around that pet. Basically, perform the necessary actions to CIAR pets when we put them in environments like the cloud. But when it comes to cattle, we should again design them to be DIE and not necessarily waste our resources, our CIA resources, on trying to secure things that are meant to DIE instead. And when it comes to understanding the what triggers or what causes or what incentivizes pet creation or what causes us to move from cattle to becoming pets, that's something that we as as practitioners should be really mindful of. Ultimately, we want to be able to exercise basically pets and cattle controls that discourage or disincentivize the creation of new pets and encourage instead the creation of new cattle. Now, for the pets that we have, we would love to be able to decommission them, right? Having too many pets, it becomes an encumbrance, becomes a burden that we have to deal with. And so we would want to find ways that we could potentially decommission the pets or replace them through the process of creative destruction. Even rebooting and reimaging helps us remove pets from our environment. But just know that that's a very, for anybody who owns a pet, getting rid of a pet is a very emotional event. So removing pets is a very hard task in many organizations, which is why we want to try to avoid having pets at all or creating pets at all. And so in the context of that, what we want to try to do is provide controls that limit the conversion of cattle into pets. Now, what causes that to happen? Well, it's when we violate any of the principles of the DIA Triad. So if we, for example, SSH into a container, we're now violating the principle of immutability, and that starts turning a cattle into a pet. Or if we allow an asset to live longer than it needs to be, then that's violating the principle of ephemerality. And so cattle, if you don't do anything with them, eventually become a pet because they've lived longer and longer. Or even simple things that we do in security, such as patching in place, that will cause cattle to become pets. One of the things that we would want to be able to do to avoid new pet creation is just to make sure people are aware when cattle become pets. And so imagine, if you will, you had a way to present a certificate of adoption whenever someone starts doing something that turns a cattle system into a pet-like system. You basically present them with a certificate and make sure they sign off on this notion that they're going to promise to give this pet a lifetime of love, care, and attention. And if they aren't willing to sign up for that, then give them the option of basically decommissioning that pet before it becomes a full-fledged pet. Now, to wrap up the NIST cybersecurity framework that we talked about earlier, let's look at what happens in the 2020s. In the 2020s, we have, as I mentioned, the core challenge is we're going to face recover-oriented attacks, basically attacks that prevent us from being able to recover. The solutions that we have will be basically things that align against the DIA Triad. Now, when it comes to IT and security, the tension, I think, will get resolved. But we have an option. I think we may end up with different outcomes based on where the pull is. So if the pull is towards, let's say, the CIO, then we have one particular outcome. If it pull is towards the CISO, meaning the CISO is able to say, hey, we need to secure everything, then we have another outcome. And then I think we have a third outcome that I'll talk about in a moment. But depending upon what your organization drives towards, we may end up with three potential outcomes. And let me tell you what those three are. So this slide is based on a book that was written by Nassim Taleb called Antifragile. If you haven't read it, it's an excellent book if you can get past some of his diatribes. But the basic principle of Antifragile is something that I'll share here in the context of what the outcomes might be. So if the CISO wins out and we end up having to secure everything that's created, then we end up with what I consider to be a fragile system, where fragility is a situation where when harm comes to the system, then you have a lot more downside than potential upside. And with respect to how we try to secure systems, oftentimes they're secured through patches and workarounds. And these sort of things actually end up causing even more fragility. Security oftentimes, as I mentioned previously, destabilizes our environments and creates more fragility. Let's suppose now the CIO wins. What we end up with here is what we consider to be a resilient system. When harm comes into the system, it may result in the destruction of that system, but that system can be recreated again pretty quickly. There's no change in the configuration. So if we practice our DIA concepts, we end up with what we would consider to be a resilient system. But I think there's another option that's even better. And the third option is when something can become anti-fragile. And anti-fragile is what I would say is a combination of DIE plus the process of creative destruction, which is really embodied in this notion that we have around chaos engineering, where we go in and shake the system to find places where we find pets. And basically, through the process of creative destruction, remove those unnecessary pets that causes fragility and instead replace them with more DIE-like system. So I think these are the three options that we have as we go forward in the future around what does the future of security look like? What should we be advocating for? And even though we as security practitioners advocate for protecting everything, doing CIA, it may actually be counterproductive, especially if we want to have more anti-fragile type of environments. Now, to be able to point people to that sort of direction, we need to be able to give them design patterns and tools and resources to be able to build things to be more DIE-like and ultimately anti-fragile. And to be able to understand what tools are available, we did a mapping to figure out what are the kind of things that we want people to start using. And so here's an example of some of the capabilities that are native to AWS that align against the DIE Triad. So in each of these different buckets, we see things that help you become more distributed, or help you become more immutable, or help you become more ephemeral, or a combination thereof. And we tried to do this also with the CNCF capabilities. By the way, so before I get too much criticism, these were things that we thought would align. So if you have any suggestions or adjustments, feel free to let us know. This is more conceptual in terms of how we want to drive towards making things more DIE. So we may have some of these mappings incorrect, but hopefully you get the idea. We were wanting organizations to practice building systems to be more DIE-like and not CIA-like, but we need to be able to, again, give them tools and resources to be able to do that. So to wrap up, when we look at the next era in security and IT, we're going to see a lot more irreversible attacks. They fundamentally will challenge our ability to recover. And as much as we like to throw more protect, detect, and respond at it, they're not going to be adequate for adequate against destructive scenarios, things that are irreversible. Once once the event has happened, there's protect, detect, and respond aren't going to help you anymore. Instead, we need recover solutions, and those recover solutions are going to be based on our ability to avoid pet creation and instead promote cattle creation instead, cattle that are built to DIE. And so with that, I'll leave you with this view that as a security professional, I want CIA to die and instead have DIE live longer. Now, I think to be able to apply these concepts in your own organization are actually pretty simple. And so here are a couple of quick tips that you can apply. I think you should be able to get data that will help you understand how closely you're hewing to the DIE principles. So get uptime measurements, for example, within your own environment and create your own pets and cattle curve. And then be able to track that over time. See what that looks like over the next couple of weeks, next couple of months. And to start be able to catalog those design patterns that tend to move you more towards cattle-like design patterns and less like pet-like design patterns. And over time, then institute policies and disincentives that challenge people when they start creating a pet or when they allow pets to become, when they allow cattle to become pets. Trigger that awareness so that people know they're about to adopt yet another pet, and give them an option to be able to avoid that scenario at all. So that's what I would encourage you guys to do as we think about the next era of security and the new paradigms that go with it. Aim for DIE. Try to avoid doing CIA. And by the way, I should mention in the context of that, it's not that we, as I mentioned, will always have pets. So those pets have to be CIA'd, no question about it. But if we design something, take the first step towards being DIE instead. And failing that, in other words, if we cannot build something to be DIE, then we have to fall back to being CIA. But make that the second step, not the first one. And with that, thank you very much for your time. And I will take questions, or I'll try to answer as many questions as I can in the 2 minutes I have remaining. But I'll also be on the Slack channel. So if you have any questions there or want to have a dialogue there, please feel free to hit me on that channel as well. And with that, thank you very much for your time.